Good evening and welcome. Settle in wherever you are. Loosen whatever is tight, dim whatever is bright, and let the day you've just lived begin to drift away from you like a tide pulling gently back from the shore. There is nothing you need to do for the next little while, nowhere you need to be, no problem you must solve before morning. For the length of this story, you can simply rest and let your mind wander far away from the present and into a world that has been gone for the better part of 1,000 years, a world of stone and smoke, of horses and iron, of men who built their entire lives around a set of ideas we still half remember and almost entirely misunderstand. Tonight, we are going to talk about knights, not the knights of the films, with their gleaming armor and their flawless courage and their perfect manners, not the knights of the bedtime stories who rescue the helpless and slay the dragon and ride away into a golden sunset. We are going to talk about the real ones, the men who actually lived inside that armor, who actually carried those swords, who actually swore those oaths. And we are going to ask a single quiet question that turns out to be far stranger and far more interesting than it first appears. Why did they do it? Why did these violent, ambitious, often ruthless men bind themselves to something called the Code of Chivalry? What did they actually get out of it? And why, when so much of it ran against their own self interest, did the code endure for centuries, shaping the lives of the most powerful people in Europe? Before we go any further, let me ask one small favor of you, and then I promise I will not interrupt the story again. If you find your shoulders dropping a little as you listen, if your breathing begins to slow and the world begins to soften at the edges, then this channel is doing exactly what it was made to do. And the simplest way you can help it keep doing that is to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the quiet machinery behind the scenes that stories like this one are worth telling. And while you're here, I'd love it if you'd leave a comment and tell me two things: where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what time it is there as you settle in. I genuinely love reading them. There is something lovely about imagining all of us scattered across the dark side of the planet, in cities and villages and farmhouses and apartments, all listening to the same old story at the same strange hour. So tell me your corner of the world in your hour, and then let yourself sink back down into the pillows. We have a long, slow journey ahead, and there is no need to hurry through any of it. Now, let us begin where all the misunderstanding begins, with the picture in your head. Close your eyes for a moment and call up the image of a knight. You will see, almost certainly, a figure in shining plate armor, a sword at his side, a lady's favor tied to his arm, his eyes steady and noble beneath the visor. You will picture honor and gallantry and a kind of effortless goodness. You may even hear, faintly, the language of the code itself. Protect the weak, honor your word, defend the faith, show mercy to the fallen, never strike a defenseless foe. This image is so deep in us that it feels less like history and more like memory, as though we ourselves had once lived in those castles. But here is the first thing to understand, and it is the thread we will pull on all night long. Almost none of that image comes from the Middle Ages. It comes from much later, from poets and novelists and painters who lived hundreds of years after the last true knight had died, and who looked back across the centuries and saw in the haze of distance exactly the noble dream they wish to see. The men who built the chivalric code would have recognized parts of it, but much of what we treasure about chivalry was assembled long after the fact, polished and perfumed, and stripped of everything that was strange and bloody and human about the original. To understand why knights really followed the code, we have to go back behind that beautiful image and find the rougher things standing in its shadow. So let us travel back. Let the centuries unspool. The factories vanish. The cities shrink to clusters of timber and thatch. The great cathedrals dissolve back into the imaginations of men not yet born. We are going to settle somewhere around the 10th and 11th centuries in the lands that would one day become France and Germany and England, in a Europe that has just come through a long darkness and is still feeling its way uncertainly toward the light. And the first thing you must understand about this world, the thing that explains almost everything that follows, is that it is dangerous. Not dangerous in the abstract, distant way we sometimes mean the word. Dangerous in the way a forest is dangerous to a small animal. The great empire of Charlemagne, which had briefly stitched much of Western Europe into a single Christian realm, had fallen apart into squabbling fragments. Central authority had crumbled. Kings existed, but their power often reached no further than they could ride in a day. And into that vacuum, into that absence of any reliable law, rode a new kind of man, armed, mounted, and answerable to almost no one. This is the man who would in time become the knight. But in these early days, he is not yet a figure of romance. He is a problem. To understand him, you have to understand the horse, because the horse is where the whole story starts. A war horse in this age was an astonishingly expensive animal, bred for size and aggression and stamina, fed on grain that could have fed a family, trained for years to charge into chaos without bolting. A single good war horse might cost as much as a small farm, and a man who fought on horseback needed more than the horse. He needed armor, which in these centuries meant a coat of interlinked iron rings, a hauberk of mail that took a skilled smith weeks to make and could cost a fortune. He needed a sword, forged and folded by a master, an object so valuable it might be named and handed down for generations. He needed a shield, a lance, a helmet. He needed servants to care for all of it, and a second horse to carry the burden and the leisure, the sheer expensive leisure, to spend his days training rather than plowing fields or weaving cloth. Put all of this together, and you arrive at an unavoidable conclusion. The mounted warrior was, by his very nature, a wealthy man, or the dependent of a wealthy man. War on horseback was not something a peasant could simply decide to do. It was a profession that required capital, and that capital came from land, and the men who held the land formed a narrow, privileged class at the top of a vast and silent pyramid of laborers. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the shining image conceals. These early mounted warriors, these proto-knights, were often little more than armed predators. Picture the reality of it. A young man, strong and trained for violence, sitting astride an animal bred to trample, encased in iron that ordinary weapons could barely scratch, carrying a lance and a sword in a countryside full of unarmed farmers who could offer no resistance whatsoever. There was no police force. There was no reliable court that could touch him. The nearest king was far away and probably indifferent. What do you imagine such a man did with his power? Some of them, certainly, served their lords loyally and kept the peace. But a great many of them did exactly what unrestrained armed men have always done. They took what they wanted. They extorted the peasants who worked the land around their fortresses. They raided their neighbors' territory, burned their crops, stole their livestock, and carried off whatever could be carried. They fought private wars over grudges and inheritances and slights to their pride. They built rough stone towers. The first castles were not the soaring fairy tale fortresses of later centuries, but crude, brutal strongpoints. And from these towers, they dominated the surrounding country like spiders at the center of a web, demanding tribute, settling scores, and answering to no higher law than their own appetite and their own fear of stronger men. Let yourself sink, for a moment, into the texture of that world, because it is so far from our own that we have to reach for it slowly. Imagine the silence of it first, a world with no engines, no electric hum, no glow on the horizon at night, a world where darkness was total and the night was genuinely to be feared. Imagine the smallness of most people's lives, bounded by a single village and the fields around it, the same faces from cradle to grave, the same church bell marking the same hours, the same forest at the edge of everything, full of wolves and outlaws and the unknown. Into the quiet of such a place, the arrival of armed horsemen was an event of pure dread. You would hear them before you saw them, the drum of hooves, the jingle of harness and mail, and you would know with a sinking certainty that whatever happened next was entirely out of your hands. Perhaps they were your own Lord's men, and they had come for the portion of your harvest that was theirs by right and by force. Perhaps they were strangers, raiders from a neighboring lord with a grudge, and they had come to burn what they could not carry. Either way, you and your family would stand in the doorway of your timber house and watch men of iron decide your fate, and there was nothing, no law, no court, no king near enough to matter, no power on earth that you could call upon that could protect you from them. That was the ordinary condition of the vast majority of human beings in this age, to live entirely at the mercy of a small number of armed men who answered to no one, and to know it in your bones every single day. And from the other side of that doorway, from inside the iron, the young warrior looked out at a world that existed, as far as he could tell, to serve and to fear him, a world he had been raised to dominate, and which offered him almost no reason beyond the slow and distant voice of his own conscience and his fear of God to use his terrible advantage gently. This was the silence that chivalry would eventually try to fill with a different sound. This is the raw material from which chivalry was carved, not a noble savage waiting to be civilized exactly, but a violent specialist, a man whose entire identity, training, and economic existence were built around the controlled application of force. The word we use for him, knight, comes from an Old English word, knight, which originally meant simply a boy, a servant, a household retainer, a reminder that the earliest knights were not lofty aristocrats, but armed dependents who served a more powerful man. But the deeper word, the one that gives us chivalry itself, comes from the French, chevalier, the knight, cheval, the horse, chevalerie, chivalry, which stripped of all its later glamour, means nothing more romantic than horsemanship, the art and the class of men who fought from the saddle. At its root, before a single poet had touched it, Chivalry simply meant the way of the warriors on horseback. Everything else, the honor, the courtesy, the protection of the weak, the service to ladies and to God, was added later, layer upon layer, for reasons we are going to spend the rest of this night exploring. And the very first reason, the foundation beneath all the others, was this. The warriors on horseback had become a problem so severe that the rest of society had no choice but to find some way to tame them. Sit with that for a moment, because it inverts everything the shining image suggests. We are taught to imagine that chivalry was the natural flowering of the knight's noble heart, that good men, being good, naturally produced a beautiful code to express their goodness. The truth runs almost exactly the other way. Chivalry was not born from the goodness of knights. It was born from the danger of them. It was a long, patient, centuries spanning attempt by the church, by kings, by the knights themselves, and by the broader society that had to live alongside these armed men to put a leash on a force that was tearing the world apart. The miracle of chivalry is not that violent men dreamed up a gentle code. The miracle is that over time, the leash actually began to hold, and to understand how that happened and why the knights eventually accepted the leash and even came to wear it with pride, we have to look first at the people who had the most reason to want these men contained and the most surprising power to contain them. We have to look at the church. In a world without a strong state, without a reliable king who could ride out and impose order, there was one institution that reached into every village, every valley, every household across the whole of Western Europe. That institution was the church. The local priest knew every family in his parish. The bishop in the nearby town held lands and revenues that rivaled those of any nobleman. The great abbeys were centers of wealth and learning and prayer, holding in their vaults not only gold, but the bones of saints, and in their libraries the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years. And crucially, the church held something no castle and no army could provide. It held the keys to the next world. In an age of deep and genuine faith, when men believed without the slightest doubt that their souls would be weighed and judged and sent to an eternity of bliss or an eternity of torment, the church's power to bless and to curse, to forgive and to condemn, was the single most potent force in human affairs. And it was the church, more than any king, that first set out to tame the knight. The trouble for the church was acute. The very men who menaced the peasants, who raided and burned and extorted, were often the same men whose violence fell upon the church's own lands and the church's own people. Monks were robbed, pilgrims were waylaid, churches were looted, their altars stripped, their priests beaten or killed. The men who did this were Christians, at least in name, baptized, believing, terrified of hell, but they had grown up in a culture where prowess and plunder were how a warrior made his way, and the clergy could not simply order them to stop. The church had no army of its own to send against them. What it had instead was the threat of damnation, and beginning in the late 10th century, in the south of France, it began to wield that threat in a deliberate, organized way. We call this movement the peace of God. Imagine the scene, because it was a kind of theater designed to move the hardest heart. A bishop would call a great open-air assembly in a field outside a town, and the crowds would gather from all the country around, peasants and townsfolk and lords and ladies, thousands upon thousands of people. And there, brought out from the monasteries and laid upon platforms for all to see would be the relics of the saints, the bones, the reliquaries glittering with gold and jewels, the holy remains believed to channel the very power of heaven. With the relics watching, as it were, the bishops would proclaim the peace. Certain people were to be protected absolutely, on pain of excommunication and eternal damnation. The clergy were not to be attacked, the poor were not to be robbed, peasants and their oxen and their tools, the means by which the whole society fed itself, were to be left unmolested. Merchants traveling the roads, women pilgrims, all were placed under the protection of God Himself, and any knight who violated that protection was threatened not merely with punishment in this world, but with the fires of the next. Knights were called forward to swear oaths over the relics, to bind themselves before the saints and the assembled multitude to keep the peace. And the weight of it, the relics, the crowds, the bishops in their robes, the genuine bone deep fear of hell that these violent men carried inside them, was tremendous. Soon the peace of God was joined by its companion, the truce of God. Where the peace protected certain people at all times, the truce protected all people at certain times. Fighting was forbidden on Sundays in honor of the Lord's Day. Then the forbidden days expanded. Fridays in memory of the crucifixion, Saturdays and Sundays, the holy seasons of Advent and Lent, the great feast days of the church calendar. Tally it all up, and the days on which a knight was permitted to wage his private wars shrank dramatically. The church was, in effect, trying to ration violence, to confine it to a narrow band of permitted days, and forbid it entirely against the helpless. Did it work perfectly? It did not. Knights broke the peace and the truce constantly, and the church's only real weapon, excommunication, was a slow and uncertain instrument. But something profound was happening beneath the surface, something that mattered far more than the immediate, imperfect enforcement. For the first time, the violence of the warrior was being measured against a standard outside himself. For the first time, it was being said, loudly and publicly, and with the authority of heaven, that there was such a thing as a wrong way to fight and a right way to fight, that the strong owed something to the weak, that a man's prowess did not entitle him to do whatever he pleased. The idea of a limit had entered the warrior's world, and once that idea was planted, it began to grow. But the church did something cleverer still, something that goes to the very heart of why knights eventually embraced a code that constrained them. The church understood that you cannot simply tell a young man bred for war that war is wicked and expect him to lay down his sword and take up the plow. The instinct toward violence, the training, the whole economic and social structure that produced these men, none of that was going anywhere. So instead of trying to eliminate the warrior, the church set out to redirect him. It offered him a story about himself that he could actually live inside, a story in which his violence, properly aimed, was not a sin that damned him, but a service that could save him. The knight, the church began to say, was not merely a man who killed. He was a defender. His sword was given to him by God, not so that he could plunder the weak, but so that he could protect them, protect the church, protect the poor, protect the widow and the orphan and the pilgrim, protect Christendom itself against its enemies. The very strength that made him dangerous could be reconceived as the strength that made him holy, if only it were turned in the right direction. This was a stroke of genius, and we must pause on it because it answers a great deal of our central question. Why did knights follow a code that limited them? Part of the answer is that the code did not only limit them, it also exalted them. It gave them something they craved as much as plunder, perhaps more. It gave them meaning and dignity and a path to salvation that did not require them to stop being what they were. A knight's trade was killing. By the strict standards of the faith, the man who shed blood imperiled his soul. Even soldiers who fought in just wars were sometimes assigned penance for the lives they had taken. This was a genuine spiritual crisis for the warrior class, and it weighed on them. These were not cynics who scoffed at religion. They believed deeply and fearfully that they would answer for their lives at the judgment seat of God, and they knew that their lives were drenched in the very thing the church called sin. The chivalric ideal offered them a way out of that terror. It told them that their killing, if it was done in defense of the church and the helpless and the faith, was not damning at all, that it was, in fact, the very thing God wanted from them. The sword that sent them to hell could, properly used, become the sword that carried them to heaven. Is it any wonder that men living in mortal dread of damnation reached for that promise with both hands? The grandest expression of this redirection, the place where it reached its terrible fullness, was the Crusade. At the very end of the 11th century, in the year 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a great assembly at Clermont in France and called upon the knights of Europe to turn their swords away from one another and toward a new and holy purpose, the recovery of Jerusalem and the holy places from the Muslim powers who held them. And here the logic of the redirected warrior reached its climax. The knight who fought in this cause, the Pope declared, would not merely be forgiven for the violence of war. He would have his sins washed away. The whole burden of guilt that a fighting man carried, the accumulated weight of a lifetime of bloodshed, could be lifted by taking up the cross and marching east. War itself, the very activity that had imperiled the warrior's soul, was now offered to him as the surest road to heaven. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of men took the cross and set out on a journey of unimaginable hardship across a world they barely understood, and whatever mixture of motives drove them, and the motives were always mixed, always braided through with ambition and greed and the hunger for land and glory. At the core of it lay this profound and genuine religious yearning. The chivalric idea that a knight's violence could be holy, could be the path to his own salvation, was not an abstraction dreamed up by clergymen. It was a living force that moved armies across continents and changed the shape of the medieval world. And it gave the knight, for the first time, a reason to accept a code, because the code told him not only what he must not do, but what he gloriously could do, and promised him heaven as the reward. You can see this whole transformation crystallized, made visible and tangible in the ceremony by which a young man actually became a knight. In the earliest days, the making of a knight had been a brusque, practical affair. A senior warrior would gird a young one with a sword and perhaps strike him a blow, and that was that, a soldier's rite of passage with no more sanctity than the handing over of tools to an apprentice. But as the centuries passed and the chivalric ideal deepened, the ceremony grew elaborate, solemn, and saturated with religious meaning, until it became one of the most important moments in a nobleman's entire life. Let us linger over it slowly, as if we were watching it unfold by candlelight, because in its details you can read the whole strange marriage of the warrior and the saint. Imagine you are that young man. You are perhaps 18, perhaps 20, and you have spent your whole life preparing for this. As a small boy, you were sent away from your mother to be raised in the household of some great lord, where you served as a page, learning courtesy and manners and the rudiments of arms, waiting at table and carrying messages, and watching the grown knights with hungry eyes. Then, as you grew, you became a squire, attached to a knight as his attendant and apprentice, caring for his horses and his armor, following him into the chaos of battle to hand him fresh weapons and drag him to safety if he fell, learning by hard experience the whole brutal craft of mounted war. You have ridden until your body knew the saddle better than the ground. You have swung sword and lance until the motions lived in your muscles without thought. You have been knocked down and bruised and humiliated, and you have stood back up year after year, and now at last the day has come when you will cross the threshold from servant to master, from squire to knight. The night before, you keep a vigil. You are taken to a chapel, and there, in the flickering dark, you keep watch over your arms through the long hours until dawn. Your sword and your armor lie upon the altar, blessed, consecrated, transformed from mere instruments of killing into sacred objects dedicated to a holy purpose. You kneel on the cold stone, you pray, you think about the life that lies ahead of you and the vows you are about to take. You are, in a very real sense, being made new, and the church has arranged the whole experience to feel like a kind of rebirth, even a kind of priesthood. In the morning, you bathe, and the bath is not merely to make you clean. It is a symbol, an echo of baptism, washing away your old self so that you can rise from the water purified, ready to be reborn as a knight. You are dressed in white, the color of innocence, and then in red, the color of the blood you are prepared to shed in the defense of the faith, and then in black or brown to remind you of death, which comes for every man and which a knight must never fear. Every garment is a sermon, every step is a lesson. Then comes the ceremony itself. A priest blesses your sword, and the words of the blessing tell you exactly what your life is now supposed to mean, that this weapon is given to you to defend churches, widows, orphans, and all the servants of God against the cruelty of the wicked. The sword is buckled to your side. Your spurs, the golden spurs that will mark you for the rest of your life as a member of the mounted elite, are fastened to your heels, often by some great lord or honored knight, as a mark of favor. And then comes the blow, the cole, or the accolade, a deliberate stroke delivered by the Lord who is making you a knight. Sometimes it was a blow of the open hand to the neck or cheek, sometimes a touch of the sword flat upon each shoulder, the gesture we still imitate in stories today. It was said to be the only blow a knight should ever receive without returning it, and it served as a kind of seal, the final stamp that completed the making of you. You rise from your knees a knight, and whatever else you are, ambitious, violent, hungry for land and glory, you have just spent a night and a morning being told, in the most powerful symbolic language your culture possessed, that you now belong to something larger than yourself, that your strength is a trust, that your sword has a sacred purpose, and that you will answer to God for how you use it. Now, we must be honest as we are going to be honest all night about the gap between the ceremony and the man. Not every knight took the vigil to heart. Not every man who knelt in that chapel walked out a changed soul. Plenty of them went straight back to raiding and extortion and private war. The incense barely faded from their clothes. But do not make the mistake of thinking the ceremony was therefore empty. Rituals shape us even when we are imperfect vessels for them. A man may fall short of his ideals every single day and still be measured by those ideals, by himself in his quieter moments and by everyone around him. The dubbing ceremony planted a standard in the heart of every knight, a picture of what he was supposed to be, and even the knight who betrayed that picture knew that he was betraying it. He could not pretend the standard did not exist. It had been laid upon his shoulders, along with the flat of the sword, witnessed by his lord and his peers, and he believed by God himself. And this brings us to one of the deepest and most practical reasons that knights followed the code, a reason that has nothing to do with goodness and everything to do with the hard machinery of how their society actually worked. To understand it, we have to talk about honor, and we have to understand that honor in this world was not a soft and sentimental thing. It was something much closer to money. We live in a world of institutions, and because we do, it can be genuinely difficult to feel our way into a world that had almost none of them. When you make an agreement today, you can write a contract, and behind that contract stands a vast invisible apparatus: courts, lawyers, police, the power of the state, ready to enforce it if the other party fails to keep their word. When you wonder whether to trust a stranger in business, you can check references, ratings, records, credit. The medieval knight had none of this. There was no reliable court that could compel a powerful man to honor his promises. There was no police force to call. There was no paperwork that meant anything against a man with a castle and a band of armed retainers. In a world like that, in the absence of institutions, what holds society together? What makes a man keep his word, pay his debts, support his allies, and refrain from simply taking whatever he is strong enough to take? The answer, the only answer available to such a world, is reputation. And the medieval word for reputation, charged with all the weight that the modern word has lost, was honor. Honor was not a feeling. This is the thing we most often get wrong about it, because in our world, honor has shrunk to a private sense of integrity, a quiet and inner conscience. In the knight's world, honor was public and external. It was your standing in the eyes of others, the sum of what everyone believed about you: your courage, your loyalty, your reliability, your prowess, your generosity, your word. Honor was, in the most literal sense, your reputation, and your reputation was your most valuable possession, more valuable in many ways than land or gold, because everything else flowed from it. A knight with a great reputation could attract followers because men wanted to serve a famous and successful lord. He could secure a brilliant marriage because families wanted to ally themselves with a man whose name was respected. He could win the patronage of kings and great nobles who advanced men of proven worth. He could borrow, bargain, command, and lead, all on the strength of his honor. And a knight whose honor was stained, who had broken his word, or shown cowardice, or betrayed an ally, or behaved with shameful cruelty in a way that crossed even the rough lines of his violent world, found every one of those doors beginning to close. Men would not follow him. Families would not marry their daughters to him. Lords would not trust him. His word would be worth nothing. And in a world that ran on the word of armed men, a man whose word was worthless was a man with no future. Do you see, then, why the Code of Chivalry was not merely a set of pretty ideals, but a working system of reputation, an honor economy as real and as consequential as any economy of coin? The Code defined what honor was. It laid out in shared and widely understood terms the qualities that made a knight admirable and the failings that made him contemptible. Prowess, skill, and courage in arms stood at the very center, the foundation of a knight's worth, because a warrior who could not fight had failed at the one thing his whole existence was built around. But prowess alone was not enough, and this is crucial. Alongside prowess stood loyalty, the absolute reliability that made a man trustworthy to his lord and his comrades. Beside loyalty stood largesse, generosity, open handedness, the willingness to give freely of one's wealth, to feast one's followers, to reward service lavishly, to scorn the hoarding of treasure as the mark of a small and grasping soul. A great lord was supposed to be a fountain of gifts, and the gifts bound men to him in loyalty and broadcast his greatness to the world. And woven through all of these was the keeping of one's word, the sacred inviolability of the oath, because in a world without contracts, the oath was the only contract there was, and a man who broke his sworn word had broken the very thread on which the whole social fabric hung. This is why knights followed the code in a way that the cynical view of pure self-interest cannot fully explain, and yet which is, at the deepest level, perfectly aligned with their self-interest. A knight who kept the code accumulated honor, and honor was capital. It could be spent, invested, drawn upon in time of need. A knight who broke the code spent down his honor, and a man who ran through his honor was as ruined as a man who ran through his fortune. The code, in other words, was the rule book of the only game that mattered, the game of reputation, and the men who played it best rose highest. This was not hypocrisy, though it could shade into hypocrisy easily enough. It was something more interesting, a moral code that was also, simultaneously, a perfectly rational strategy for success. The knight who protected the weak and kept his word and showed mercy to a fallen foe was very often both expressing a sincere ideal and making a shrewd investment in his own standing. The two were not opposites. They were the same act, seen from two angles. And the genius of chivalry, the reason it took hold and lasted, is precisely that it fused the ideal and the self-interested so tightly that much of the time you could not pull them apart. To make this concrete, to feel the weight of it, consider the elaborate machinery that the knightly world built to keep score in the honor economy. Consider the herald. The heralds were the record keepers of chivalry, men who knew the coats of arms of every knight and noble house, who could identify a warrior by the device on his shield, who memorized lineages and deeds and reputations. At tournaments and on battlefields, the heralds watched and remembered, marking who had fought bravely and who had hung back, who had performed great feats and who had shamed himself. Consider the coat of arms itself, that unique heraldic device passed down through a family, which served as a kind of visible badge of honor, a name made into a picture, so that a knight's reputation could be attached to a symbol that everyone could recognize and remember. Consider the chroniclers and poets who recorded the deeds of great knights, spreading their fame across the land and down through the years, granting them the one form of immortality that a warrior could reach, to be remembered, to have one's name live on in story long after one's body had returned to dust. The whole apparatus existed for a single purpose: to track, to broadcast, and to preserve honor, because honor was the currency in which a knight's life was denominated, and the men who built that apparatus understood with perfect clarity that in a world without institutions, reputation was everything. Follow the code, and you accumulated the only wealth that could not be stolen. Break it, and no castle and no army could save you from the slow ruin of a tarnished name. And now we come to what is perhaps the most revealing reason of all, the one that strips away the romance most completely and shows you the hard skeleton beneath the shining armor. For all its talk of God and honor and the protection of the weak, chivalry had at its core a startlingly practical, even mercenary logic, a logic of money. To understand it, you have to ask a simple question that the romantic image never lets us ask. When a knight defeated an enemy knight in battle, what did he actually do with him? The stories suggest a clean and noble answer. The victor, in his mercy, spared the vanquished, because mercy to a fallen foe was part of the code. And that is true as far as it goes. But it leaves out the reason behind the mercy, and the reason is one of the great open secrets of the medieval world. A captured knight was not a problem to be disposed of. A captured knight was a prize, a walking treasure chest, an asset worth more alive than dead, because a captured knight could be ransomed. This is the economic engine that hums beneath the whole chivalric ideal of mercy, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. When one knight captured another in battle, the captive became in effect his property, and a valuable property indeed. The captor would hold his prisoner, treat him according to his rank, and negotiate a ransom with the prisoner's family and lord. The sum could be staggering. The ransom of a great noble could amount to a fortune that would set a man and his descendants up for life. The ransom of a king could nearly bankrupt a kingdom. And so the mercy of chivalry, the noble refusal to slaughter a defeated enemy, turns out to be braided inseparably with the hardest of economic incentives. Why would you kill a man worth a fortune in ransom? Killing him gained you nothing but a corpse. Capturing him gained you a treasure. The code that told knights to spare the fallen was, viewed from one angle, simply the codification of the most profitable possible behavior on a medieval battlefield. As mercy paid. Mercy paid magnificently, and a great deal of what looks, in the chronicles, like sublime chivalric restraint was at least in part the cold arithmetic of men who knew exactly what a captured peer was worth. But notice, and this is the part that exposes the true nature of chivalry more sharply than anything else. Notice who this mercy was for. The ransom system, the whole apparatus of capturing rather than killing, applied to knights. It applied to the nobility, to the men of rank and birth and wealth, the men who could pay or who had families, and lords who would pay for them. It was, in essence, an insurance system that the warrior elite operated for their mutual benefit, an unspoken agreement among the members of an exclusive club that they would not slaughter one another in war, but would instead capture and ransom, and in time, release one another, so that the same men could meet again on another battlefield, another year, and do it all over again. War, for the knightly class, could be terrifyingly dangerous, but it was rarely meant to be exterminating. A nobleman might expect, even in defeat, to be taken prisoner, treated with courtesy appropriate to his station, and eventually returned home for a price. It was, in a grim way, almost civilized. It was, in another grim way, a system by which the powerful protected the powerful, and the men who were not part of the club, the common soldiers, the foot levies, the peasants conscripted to swell the ranks, the archers and spearmen, and the ordinary people of the lands across which these wars were fought, received no such mercy. A common soldier was worth nothing in ransom. He had no wealthy family to pay for his release, no lord who would empty his coffers to recover him. And so, when the killing started in earnest, it was the common men who were cut down without a second thought, slaughtered in their thousands, while the noblemen around them were being carefully captured and led off to comfortable captivity. The chivalric code that softened war for the elite did nothing at all to soften it for everyone else. The peasant whose village lay in the path of an army could expect to be robbed, burned out, raped, and killed, and chivalry would not lift a finger to protect him, whatever the blessings over the swords had promised about defending the poor. The mercy of the knight was, at bottom, a courtesy extended by the powerful to the powerful, a mark of membership in an exclusive order, and it was almost entirely invisible to the vast majority of human beings whose misfortune it was to live and die beneath the hooves of the chivalric class. We can see the whole grim logic of this system and the horror of what happened when it broke down in a single famous episode. At the Battle of Agincourt in the autumn of 1415, an English army under King Henry V, exhausted and badly outnumbered, faced the flower of French chivalry in a muddy field in northern France. The battle went catastrophically for the French, whose heavily armored knights floundered in the churned mud and were cut down by English archers and men-at-arms. And in the course of that day, the English took an enormous number of high-ranking French prisoners, a fortune in ransoms, the living treasure of the French nobility, held under guard behind the English lines. And then, at a critical moment, fearing that the still numerous French might rally and that his prisoners might rise up and rejoin the fight, King Henry gave an order that horrified even his own men: kill the prisoners. Not the common soldiers, who would have been killed as a matter of course, but the noble captives, the very men whose ransoms represented immense wealth, the men whom the entire chivalric system was designed to spare. Many of the English soldiers are said to have hesitated, and not only out of moral scruple. To kill a valuable prisoner was to throw away a fortune, to violate the deepest economic logic of their world. In the end, the order was partly carried out, and a number of French nobles, who should by every rule of chivalry have been ransomed and sent home, were instead slaughtered in cold blood. The episode shocked contemporaries precisely because it tore the mask off. It revealed, in a single brutal moment, that the gentle restraint of chivalry was not an unbreakable law of nature, but a fragile convention, observed when it was convenient and profitable, and abandoned the instant that survival demanded it. The code held until it didn't, and the men who lived inside it understood better than the Romantic centuries that followed, exactly how thin the line was between the chivalrous and the merciless, and exactly how much of their famous mercy was, in the end, a matter of money. If war was the deadly serious business of the night, the tournament was its mirror and its rehearsal, and the tournament, more than any sermon or any ceremony, was where the culture of chivalry actually lived and breathed and reproduced itself. We picture the tournament today as a colorful pageant, two knights in gleaming armor thundering toward each other down a fenced lane, lances leveled, while ladies wave from the stands and trumpets blare. That image is real enough, but it belongs to the late, refined, theatrical form of the tournament. In its earlier days, the tournament was something much wilder and much more dangerous, and understanding what it really was tells you a great deal about why knights followed the code, because the tournament was that engine that turned the code into a living competitive culture. The early tournament was not a single combat between two riders. It was a melee, a great mock battle fought across open country between two large bands of knights, sometimes hundreds on each side, ranging over fields and through villages, with few rules and real weapons. It was, in almost every respect, except the explicit intention to kill, indistinguishable from an actual battle. Men were injured constantly, men died, bones were broken, skulls were cracked, horses were ridden to death. The church disapproved of tournaments for exactly this reason, condemning them again and again, even refusing Christian burial to those who died in them, because to the clergy a tournament was a senseless squandering of Christian lives and Christian strength in the pursuit of vanity. But the knights loved them, and they loved them for reasons that go right to the heart of our whole inquiry. First, and most obviously, the tournament was training, the only way, short of actual war, to practice the brutal craft of mounted combat against opponents who were really trying to unhorse you. A knight who fought regularly in tournaments stayed sharp, stayed fit, stayed accustomed to the terror and confusion of a cavalry engagement, so that when the real thing came, he would not freeze. In an age before standing armies and organized military drill, the tournament was the school of war, the place where a young knight learned his trade and an older one kept his edge. But it was far more than a school. It was also, and this is the part the romantic image hides, a business, a way to get rich. Because the tournament operated on the same logic as the battlefield, when you unhorsed and defeated an opponent in the melee, you could capture him and his horse and his armor and ransom him back to himself, exactly as you would in a real war. A skilled and aggressive knight could ride the tournament circuit, traveling from one great event to the next, across France and the Low Countries, and into the Empire, and make a fortune capturing other knights and their costly equipment. The tournament was a marketplace of honor and a marketplace of money braided together, and for a landless young knight with nothing but his skill and his courage, it was a path to wealth and fame and advancement that existed almost nowhere else. There is no better illustration of this than the life of the man often called the greatest knight of the Middle Ages, William Marshall. He was born a younger son of a minor English noble family, with no land of his own and no prospects to speak of, the kind of young man who, in this world, had to make his own fortune or have none at all. As a boy, he was nearly executed when his father used him as a hostage and then defied the king who held him, gambling coldly, that he could simply father more sons. The king, to his credit, could not bring himself to harm the child. William grew up, became a squire, was knighted, and then discovered the one thing he was supremely good at: fighting in tournaments. He threw himself into the circuit, and he was magnificent at it. For years he traveled from tournament to tournament, often partnered with another knight, capturing opponents and their horses and armor in such numbers that the two of them once kept a clerk to tally their winnings, and the tally ran into the dozens of knights captured in a single span of months. He won a fortune. More than that, he won a reputation, the priceless reputation of a man unbeatable in arms, and that reputation opened every door. It carried him into the service of kings. It made him the trusted guardian and tutor in arms of a royal heir. It won him, in the end, a great heiress in marriage, and with her vast lands and a title, so that the landless younger son rose to become one of the mightiest barons in England, and at last, in his old age, the regent who ruled the entire kingdom on behalf of a child king. His whole towering ascent began in the mud and chaos of the tournament field with a young man's skill and nerve, and it shows you with perfect clarity why knights embraced the chivalric world. Honor was not only a beautiful ideal, honor demonstrated in arms was the ladder by which a man could climb from nothing to nearly the top of the world. And the tournament was something else besides. It was theater, spectacle, the great social occasion of the knightly world, and over time it became ever more elaborate and refined, the dangerous melee giving way to the formal joust, the open country to the enclosed and decorated lists, the indifference of the early crowds to the rapt attention of an audience of nobles and, crucially, of ladies. This is where the threads of our story begin to weave together, because the tournament was the stage on which a knight performed his prowess, not only for other men, but for women, for the wives and daughters and sisters of the nobility who watched from the stands and whose admiration a knight craved. A lady might give a knight her favor, a scarf or a sleeve, or a ribbon to wear into the lists, a token that he carried as a sign of her regard and that he fought to honor. The performance of prowess became entangled with the performance of devotion, and out of that entanglement grew one of the strangest and most beautiful and most misunderstood elements of the whole chivalric world, an idea that took the rough warrior and tried to teach him tenderness, an idea we call courtly love. Courtly love is, in many ways, the part of chivalry that has traveled furthest into our own imagination, and also the part we understand least. When we picture the gallant knight pledging his undying devotion to a noble lady, performing brave deeds in her honor, worshiping her from a respectful distance, we are drawing on this tradition. But the reality of courtly love was far stranger, far more artificial, and far more revealing than the soft picture suggests. It arose in the courts of southern France in the 12th century, in the songs of the troubadours, those poet-musicians who sang of a new and refined kind of love. And the love they sang of was not, for the most part, the love of a husband for his wife. It was something deliberately, almost defiantly different, the love of a knight or a poet for a lady who was usually married, usually of higher rank than himself, and usually unattainable. It was a love of yearning and service and worship from below, a love in which the lady was elevated to an almost divine height, and the lover abased himself before her, hoping for nothing more than her glance, her word, her smile, suffering exquisitely in the gap between his desire and its fulfillment. To our ears, this can sound merely sentimental, but to understand why it mattered, we have to set it against the actual condition of love and marriage in the noble world. Marriage among the aristocracy had almost nothing to do with love. It was a transaction, an alliance between families, a transfer of land and wealth and political advantage, arranged by parents and lords with cold attention to property and bloodline, and almost no attention at all to the feelings of the two people being joined. A great heiress might be married off to seal a treaty. A young noblewoman might be handed to a man decades her senior whom she had never met. Love was simply not what marriage was for. Into that loveless and transactional landscape, courtly love introduced something genuinely new and genuinely subversive. The radical idea that love itself, the emotion, the longing, the devotion, was a thing of supreme value, a force that could ennoble and refine and even perfect the person who felt it. And it placed the woman, for once, in a position of power. In the world of courtly love, the lady commanded and the knight obeyed. The lady judged, and the knight strove to be worthy of her judgment. In a society where noble women were, in nearly every legal and practical sense, the property and instruments of the men around them, married off, used to bear heirs and forge alliances, valued for their wombs and their dowries, the literary world of courtly love offered them, at least within the safe boundaries of the imagination and the poem, a fleeting sovereignty. We must be careful here and resist the temptation to romanticize. There is a long and not entirely settled debate about how much courtly love was ever actually lived and how much it remained a literary game, a fashionable fantasy entertained in song and story and elaborate flirtation, but rarely enacted in the messy reality of life. The truth is probably that it was both, a real social practice of refined flirtation and idealized devotion at certain sophisticated courts, and also a literary ideal that ran far ahead of anything most people ever experienced. The great patrons of this culture were powerful noblewomen, above all, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable figures of the entire age, who was successively Queen of France and Queen of England, and who carried the troubadour culture of her southern homeland into the courts of the north, and her daughter Marie, Countess of Champagne, who patronized poets and presided over a court where the rules of love were debated as seriously as the rules of war. At Marie's court, a writer named Andreas produced a famous treatise that laid out the laws of love in mock solemn detail, half in earnest and half in irony. And the very existence of such a work tells you how much pleasure this aristocratic world took in the elaborate game of refined desire. But whether lived or merely imagined, courtly love had a real effect on the chivalric ideal, and it is this effect that concerns us. For courtly love did to the knight's manners what the church had done to his violence. It tried to refine him, to civilize him, to add to the warrior a new dimension of grace. The knight of the courtly tradition was not only supposed to be brave and loyal and strong, he was supposed to be courteous, gentle in his bearing, eloquent, sensitive, capable of poetry and music and the delicate arts of the court, as well as the brutal arts of war. He was supposed to control his passions, to master himself, to channel his desire into worship and service rather than seizure and force. The very word courtesy comes from the court, from the refined manners expected of those who moved in the highest circles, and courtly love was the school in which a rough fighting man was taught to be a gentleman. Whether or not any particular knight actually loved any particular lady in the prescribed manner, the ideal pulled at the whole class, holding up a vision of the knight as a being of cultivated refinement and not merely of violence, and that vision became woven into the chivalric code itself until protecting and honoring and serving women, at least women of one's own class, became one of the marks of the true knight. It was, like so much of chivalry, an ideal that real men constantly betrayed. The same century that produced the songs of courtly love produced an ocean of violence against women that the songs did nothing to prevent. But the ideal existed, and it pointed somewhere, and it formed part of the strange and contradictory picture of what a knight was supposed to be: a killer who was also a poet, a man of iron who was also, in the presence of his lady, a man of velvet. But where did a knight learn what a knight was supposed to be? Where did this whole picture, the brave warrior, the loyal vassal, the protector of the weak, the courteous lover, the holy crusader, actually take hold in the minds of real men? Not chiefly from sermons, and not from treatises. It took hold from stories. The chivalric world was above all a storytelling world, and the stories it told itself shaped its members as powerfully as any law or any ceremony. We come now to one of the most important and most overlooked reasons that knights followed the code. They had grown up inside a vast literature that taught them, from childhood, exactly what an admirable man looked like, and they spent their lives consciously, deliberately, sometimes almost desperately, trying to become the heroes of those stories. There were two great streams of this literature, and they fed the knightly imagination in different ways. The first and older stream was the chanson de geste, the song of deeds, the great martial epics chanted aloud in the halls that celebrated the heroic warriors of an idealized past. The most famous of them, the Song of Roland, told of a band of Frankish warriors, the companions of Charlemagne, and above all of the hero Roland, who with his fellow knights makes a doomed last stand against overwhelming odds, fighting to the death rather than yield, choosing glory and honor over survival. These songs were not subtle. They glorified courage, loyalty to one's lord, prowess in battle, and a fierce, uncompromising devotion to the warrior's code of honor, even unto death. A boy raised in a noble household heard these songs again and again, absorbed them into his bones, learned from them that the highest thing a man could do was to fight bravely, serve faithfully, and die gloriously rather than live in shame. The chansons were, in effect, the propaganda of the warrior class, the stories it told to glorify itself and to instruct its young, and they worked. Knights measured themselves against Roland and the heroes of old, and the measuring shaped what they did. The second stream was newer, more refined, and in the long run even more influential. The romance, and above all the romances of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Beginning in the 12th century, writers like Chrétien de Troyes in France took the legends of Arthur and transformed them into something new, long, intricate tales of individual knights who set out on quests, who faced not only battles, but tests of character, who navigated the demands of love and honor and loyalty and faith, who sometimes failed and learned from their failures. The Arthurian world gave chivalry its most enduring and beautiful symbols: the round table itself, around which the knights sat as equals, the great fellowship of knighthood bound together in a single noble enterprise, the quest for the Holy Grail, in which the knight's adventure became a spiritual journey toward God, and figures like Lancelot, the greatest knight of all, torn tragically between his loyalty to his king and his forbidden love for his queen. These stories did something the older epics did not. They held up not just the ideal of the brave warrior, but the ideal of the whole knight, the complete chivalric man, valiant and devout and courteous and true, the perfect fusion of all the strands we have been tracing. And real knights drank them in and tried to live by them. It is genuinely striking, when you look closely at the historical record, how seriously the knightly class took these fictions, how thoroughly the line between the stories and real life blurred. Knights named their children after characters from the romances. They held tournaments themed on the Round Table, where men dressed as Arthurian knights and acted out the fellowship of the legends. Kings founded actual orders of knighthood deliberately modeled on the Round Table, gathering chosen knights into elite brotherhoods bound by vows of mutual loyalty and chivalric conduct. Edward III of England, in the 14th century, was so taken with the Arthurian dream that he set out to build a great round table of his own and founded the Order of the Garter, the most prestigious order of chivalry in England, gathering an elite company of knights in conscious imitation of the legendary fellowship. The men who ran kingdoms and fought wars and shed real blood looked to fictional heroes as their models and tried, with whatever mixture of sincerity and theater, to make themselves into living versions of the knights of romance. This is one of the deepest answers to our question. Knights followed the code in part because the code was the plot of the greatest stories they knew, and every man, in some quiet chamber of his heart, wants to be the hero of the story. They had been told since childhood what a hero looked like. They spent their lives reaching for it, and the reaching, even when it fell short, even when it curdled into mere display, was real, and it shaped a civilization. And yet, we must not let the beauty of the stories blind us to the reality, because the gap between the ideal and the actual was vast, and dwelling honestly in that gap is the only way to understand chivalry as it truly was, rather than as it dreamed of being. For all the songs about protecting the weak, the lived history of the knightly class is, in large part, a history of appalling violence against precisely the weak that chivalry claimed to defend. We have already seen how the mercy of chivalry stopped at the boundary of the noble class, how the common soldier and the peasant received none of its protections. But it went much further than passive neglect. The knights of the Middle Ages did not merely fail to protect the helpless, they actively, systematically, and as a matter of deliberate strategy, made war upon them. The clearest example is a practice that became central to medieval warfare, especially during the long agony of the 100 Years' War between England and France. It was called the chevauchée, which means simply a ride, a mounted raid. But what it meant in practice was the deliberate devastation of the enemy's countryside. An army, often led by the most celebrated and chivalrous knights of the age, would ride through enemy territory, not to capture cities or hold ground, but to destroy, to burn the villages, torch the crops in the fields, slaughter or steal the livestock, ruin the mills and the orchards, and terrorize, rob, and kill the peasants who lived there. The strategy was coldly rational. By devastating the countryside, an army could ruin the enemy king's tax base, demonstrate that he could not protect his own people, demoralize his realm, and provoke him into a battle he might not want to fight. It was economic warfare waged against civilians, and it was practiced by the very flower of chivalry, by knights who in the evening might listen to songs about defending the poor, and in the morning would put a peasant village to the torch without a flicker of contradiction. The same Black Prince, Edward of England, remembered in the Romantic tradition as a paragon of chivalry, led devastating chevauchées across France, and presided over the brutal sack of a French city in which thousands of inhabitants, men, women, and children, were massacred. How are we to make sense of this? Of men who genuinely believed in the chivalric ideal, who took its rituals seriously, who measured themselves against Roland and the Knights of the Round Table, and who simultaneously burned villages full of helpless people and felt no shame about it at all. The answer lies in understanding what the code actually was, as opposed to what its language seemed to say. Chivalry was not, despite its universal sounding rhetoric about defending the weak, a universal ethic. It was a class code. It was the internal honor system of an exclusive warrior aristocracy, and its obligations were owed in practice almost entirely to other members of that aristocracy. A knight owed honor, courtesy, mercy, and good faith to other knights, to his peers, the people who counted, the people whose opinion constituted the honor economy in which he lived and died. To everyone else, the obligations simply did not apply with anything like the same force. The peasant was not a member of the club. The common soldier was not a member of the club. The enemy of a different faith, in the eyes of many knights, was not even fully a person to whom the rules of mercy were owed. And so a knight could be, at one and the same time, scrupulously honorable toward his fellow nobles and utterly merciless toward everyone beneath them, and feel no contradiction whatsoever, because the code had never really asked him to extend its protections beyond the boundaries of his own class. The talk of protecting the weak was in part genuine aspiration, and in part a flattering self-image, a story the knightly class told about itself that made its dominance feel like service. The reality was that chivalry protected the powerful from the powerful and left the powerless to fend for themselves. This is the hardest truth of our whole inquiry, and it is essential not to flinch from it. The romantic image of chivalry is not merely incomplete. It is, in a sense, an inversion of the most important fact about the code, which is that it was an instrument of a ruling class. Chivalry helped the nobility think well of itself. It dressed up the brute fact of aristocratic domination, the fact that a tiny minority of armed men extracted the wealth produced by a vast majority of laborers and enforced that extraction with violence in the beautiful language of honor and service and divine purpose. It told the knight that he sat at the top of society not because he was strong enough to take what he wanted, but because he was noble, because he served, because he protected, because God had given him his sword for a sacred purpose. And this story was not only told to the peasants to keep them obedient, it was told, above all, to the knights themselves, who needed to believe it in order to live with what they were and what they did. Chivalry, seen clearly, was partly a genuine moral aspiration and partly the ideology of a warrior elite. The set of flattering ideas by which the men who ruled by force persuaded themselves and others that their rule was just. Both things were true at once, and holding both of them in your mind at the same time, refusing to collapse the contradiction in either direction, is the only way to see chivalry as it really was. And yet, and here the story turns again, as it must, because the whole truth is never simple. It would be just as great a mistake to swing all the way to cynicism, to conclude that chivalry was nothing but hypocrisy and self interest and ideology, a beautiful lie with nothing real behind it. Because there were knights, real men whose names we know, who took the code with a depth of sincerity that cannot be explained away as mere calculation, who wrote about it and reflected on it, and tried with evident anguish and devotion to live up to it. And among them, none speaks more directly across the centuries than a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny. Charny was no romantic dreamer spinning fantasies from a comfortable distance. He was one of the most respected and experienced soldiers of his age, a hardened veteran of decades of war, a man who had fought and bled and been captured and ransomed and fought again, who had earned a reputation across France as the very model of the accomplished knight. And toward the end of his life, in the middle of the 14th century, this practical fighting man sat down and wrote a book about chivalry. A book that is not a romance, not a fantasy, but a sober, thoughtful, deeply serious reflection on what it actually meant to be a knight, written by a man who had spent his whole life doing it. And what comes through the pages of Charny's book is not cynicism, but a kind of demanding, clear-eyed, almost austere idealism. He writes about the hardships of the knightly life with unsentimental honesty, the cold, the hunger, the fear, the exhaustion, the constant nearness of death. And he insists that it is precisely through enduring these hardships, through suffering and effort, and the disciplined pursuit of worthy deeds, that a knight earns his honor and proves his worth. He is contemptuous of knights who seek ease and comfort and empty display. He demands courage, loyalty, humility before God, and above all, a life of genuine, costly action rather than mere talk. And running through it all is a profound religious seriousness, a conviction that the knight's life, lived rightly, is a path to God, and that the highest knighthood is inseparable from faith and from the willingness to suffer and die in a worthy cause. Charny did not merely write about dying in a worthy cause. He did it. He was entrusted with the most sacred battlefield honor that France could bestow, the right to carry the oriflamme, the sacred banner of the French crown, into battle, a duty given only to a knight of the highest trust and courage, and one that placed its bearer at the very heart of the fighting and the very front of the danger. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, another catastrophe for French chivalry, Charny carried the oriflamme, and when the battle turned against the French and the king himself was in peril of capture, Charny stood his ground in the press around his sovereign and was cut down, the sacred banner still in his hands, dying exactly the death that his book had described as the noblest a knight could hope for. He was, in the end, the thing he wrote about, and his life and his death stand as the answer to anyone who would reduce chivalry to nothing but ransom and reputation and class interest. For some men, not all, perhaps not most, but some, and those often the most admired. The code was a genuine spiritual discipline, a demanding ideal that shaped how they lived and how they were willing to die, and they pursued it not because it paid, but because they believed in it with their whole hearts. This is why no single explanation of why knights followed the code can ever be enough, and why anyone who offers you a tidy answer is selling you a fraction of the truth. The cynic says they followed it for money and power and self interest, and the code was an ideology that served the ruling class. And the cynic is right. The romantic says they followed it because they believed in honor and faith and the protection of the weak, and the code was a genuine moral ideal that lifted men above their baser instincts. And the romantic is also right. The deepest truth of chivalry is that it was both of these things at once, inseparably, in the same men at the same time, often in the same act. The knight who spared a noble enemy was making money and expressing mercy. The knight who fought bravely was advancing his career and pursuing genuine glory. The knight who took the cross was hungry for land and yearning for salvation. The code endured for centuries precisely because it managed this extraordinary fusion, because it aligned the deepest ideals of a warrior society with the deepest interests of that society, so that to be good, by the standards of the code, was very often also to be successful, and a man could pursue his own advancement and his own salvation and his own honor all at once, in the same motion, and feel much of the time no contradiction at all. So let us gather up the threads now, slowly, as the night deepens, and lay them side by side, and see the whole strange tapestry of why these men really followed the code that defined them. Because there was never one reason. There were many, braided so tightly together that the knights themselves could not have pulled them apart, and it is in the weaving of them that the real answer lies. They followed it, first, because they were afraid of hell. This is easy to forget in our secular age, but it was perhaps the most powerful force of all. These were men whose trade was killing, living in a culture that told them, with total conviction, that they would be judged for every drop of blood they shed, and that the punishment for the unrepentant could be an eternity of torment beyond all imagining. The chivalric code, with its religious dimension, its blessing of the sword for holy purposes, its promise that violence rightly directed could be not sin, but service, offered these terrified men a way to be what they were and still hope for heaven. It transformed the very source of their guilt into a possible source of their salvation. For a man who genuinely believed in the fires of hell and who knew his hands were red, that was not a small thing. It was everything. They followed it, second, because honor was the only currency that could buy them everything else they wanted, and the code was the rulebook of honor. In a world without strong institutions, without reliable law or courts or contracts, reputation was the foundation on which a man built his whole life, his followers, his marriage, his lands, his advancement, his very ability to function as a powerful man among powerful men. The code defined what honor was, and the man who kept the code accumulated honor, and honor opened every door. To follow the code was very simply to play successfully the only game that mattered. It was the path to wealth and power, and the good marriage, and the trust of kings. Self-interest and the ideal pointed much of the time in exactly the same direction, and a wise knight followed both at once. They followed it, third, because it protected them. The whole apparatus of ransom and mercy, and the conventions of war among the noble class, amounted to a kind of mutual insurance policy, an agreement among the members of an exclusive club that they would capture rather than slaughter one another, ransom rather than kill, so that even in defeat a nobleman might expect to survive and return home for a price. The code made war for the knightly class survivable in a way it was not for anyone beneath them. A man who honored the conventions could expect those conventions to be honored in return when his own luck ran out and he found himself the prisoner rather than the captor. Self preservation, dressed in the language of mercy, ran deep beneath the surface of the code. They followed it, fourth, because it told them who they were and lifted them above everyone else. Chivalry was the badge of an elite, the mark that separated the noble warrior from the common herd, and it gave the knightly class an identity, a dignity, a story about itself that made its dominance feel not like brute power, but like noble service. To be a knight, to follow the code, was to belong to the finest fellowship in the world, the company of the brave and the honorable and the chosen, the heirs of Roland and the companions of Arthur. Men will do a great deal to belong to something they believe is glorious, and chivalry offered the most glorious belonging that medieval society had to give, and they followed it, fifth and finally, because a great many of them actually believed in it. This is the thread we must never let drop, no matter how clearly we see all the others. Beneath the calculation and the self interest and the ideology, there beat in many of these men a genuine devotion to the ideal, a real love of courage and loyalty and faith and honor, a real desire to be the kind of man the stories praised, a real anguish when they fell short, and a real striving to do better. Men like Geoffroy de Charny did not write and live and die for the code because it paid. They did it because they believed with their whole hearts that the chivalric life, lived truly, was the noblest thing a man could do, and that to die for it was to die well. The cynicism that sees only the self interest misses something essential about human beings, that we are capable of believing in our ideals even as we exploit them, of being moved by what flatters us, of genuinely loving the very stories that happen also to serve our interests. The knights were not pure hypocrites, and they were not pure idealists. They were human, which means they were both woven together so finely that the seam disappears. That is the real answer to why knights followed the code of chivalry. Not because they were the flawless heroes of the romantic image, and not because they were merely cynical brutes hiding behind a beautiful lie, but because the code, in its strange genius, gathered up everything a man could want: salvation, honor, wealth, power, identity, glory, and the genuine longing to be good, and bound it all into a single ideal, so that to pursue the ideal was, very often, to pursue everything else as well. It survived because it served. It endured because it fused the highest aspirations of a warrior society with the deepest interests of that society, and offered men a way to be ambitious and merciful, violent and holy, self-serving and sincere, all at the same time. That is why it lasted for centuries. That is why it still haunts us. And that, in the end, is why these hard and dangerous men bound themselves generation after generation to a code that asked so much of them, because in following it, they were not only constraining themselves, they were becoming everything they wanted to be. There is one more reason, a quieter and more practical one that we should not pass by because it operated beneath all the grand questions of salvation and honor and belief, down in the hard, immediate reality of the battlefield itself. The Code of Chivalry, for all its poetry, was also a working military doctrine, and many of its central values existed because they were the values an army of mounted warriors needed in order to function and to win. To feel the force of this, you have to imagine, slowly and carefully, what it was actually like to fight as a knight, because the experience explains the code from the inside. Picture a battlefield in the High Middle Ages. There are no neat lines of disciplined soldiers as we might imagine from later centuries. There is a churning, deafening, terrifying chaos. You are on horseback, encased in iron, your vision narrowed to a slit, the noise around you a wall of sound, the screaming of horses, the clash and crash of metal, the shouts and grunts and cries of hundreds or thousands of men trying to kill one another at close quarters. The ground beneath the hooves turns to mud and worse. Dust and blood are in the air. And into this maelstrom you are expected to ride, to hold your place in the charge, to keep formation with the knights around you, to close with the enemy and not to break and not to flee. Now ask yourself what holds an army together in a moment like that. What stops every individual man from doing the rational, animal thing, which is to turn his horse and ride for his life? What keeps the line intact when terror is screaming at every man to save himself? The answer is the very cluster of values that sit at the heart of the chivalric code. Courage, prized above almost everything, because an army of cowards is no army at all, and the single most important quality a warrior could have was the will to stand and fight when his body was begging him to run. Loyalty, the absolute commitment to one's lord and one's comrades, because a man who would not abandon the brothers beside him made the line hold, and a line that held was a line that won. The horror of shame, the unbearable disgrace of cowardice, which the whole honor culture cultivated so deliberately, because the fear of being known as a coward had to be made stronger than the fear of death itself, or no man would ever stand his ground. When you understand this, the chivalric obsession with courage and loyalty and the avoidance of shame stops looking like mere aristocratic vanity and starts looking like exactly what it also was: the psychological machinery by which a society turned frightened individual men into a cohesive fighting force that could ride into hell and not dissolve. The code was, among everything else it was, a technology of war, a set of values precisely calibrated to produce men who would fight bravely, hold together, and die rather than disgrace themselves. A warrior class that did not cultivate those values would lose its wars and cease to exist. The ones who cultivated them survived and conquered and passed the code down to their sons. In this hard sense, chivalry was not only beautiful and not only self-serving, it was, quite literally, what kept the knightly class alive on the field where it mattered most. And this practical military foundation is also, in the end, what doomed it. For the whole towering edifice of chivalry rested upon a single material fact: that the heavily armored mounted knight was the supreme weapon of war, the decisive force on the battlefield, the instrument that won battles, and therefore the man who deserved to rule. Chivalry was the culture of the dominant military caste, and it could remain the ruling ideal of society only as long as that caste remained dominant. The moment the armored horseman ceased to be the master of the battlefield, the whole social and cultural order built upon him began slowly and then quickly to come apart. And over the later centuries of the Middle Ages, that is exactly what happened. The undoing of the knight did not come all at once, but in a series of shocks, each one chipping away at the foundation of his supremacy until the man on the armored horse, who had ruled the battlefields of Europe for centuries, was at last revealed to be obsolete. The first great shock came from a weapon so humble that the chivalric mind could barely comprehend the insult of it: the bow. Specifically, the great war bow, the longbow drawn by trained English archers, men of common birth, peasants, and yeomen, who could loose arrows in such numbers and with such force that they could pierce armor and bring down a charging knight before he ever reached their line. At a series of catastrophic battles in the long wars between England and France, at Crécy, at Poitiers, at Agincourt, the proud chivalry of France charged into storms of English arrows and was annihilated. The flower of the nobility, the consecrated knights with their blessed swords and their golden spurs, were cut down in their hundreds and their thousands by low-born bowmen who would never be ransomed, never be honored, never be admitted to the fellowship of chivalry, but who could nonetheless, from a safe distance, kill the noblest knight in Christendom as easily as the meanest foot soldier. There was something profoundly shocking to the medieval mind about this, something that violated the whole moral order of war as chivalry understood it. The knight was supposed to be supreme, the peasant was supposed to be helpless, and now the peasant, with a stick and a string, was slaughtering the knight. Other shocks followed, each one driving the same lesson deeper. In the towns of the Low Countries and on the slopes of the Swiss mountains, disciplined formations of common infantry, townsmen and farmers armed with pikes and halberds, fighting shoulder to shoulder in tight masses, learned that they could stand against a cavalry charge and break it, that a hedge of spears held by determined men could stop the armored horse and even destroy the knights who rode it. The mounted warrior, who had counted on the terror of his charge to scatter any infantry before him, found that infantry which did not scatter, which held its nerve and its formation, could turn the charge into a massacre of horsemen. And then, slowly at first, and then with gathering force, came the final and decisive blow: gunpowder. The cannon, which could batter down the proudest castle walls that had once made a lord untouchable. The handgun, and eventually the musket, which could be put into the hands of a common soldier after a few weeks of training, and which could punch through the finest, most expensive armor that the wealthiest knight could buy. The whole logic of the knight had rested on the immense investment of a lifetime. The years of training from childhood, the fortune in horse and armor and weapons, the inherited skill and breeding that made a man a master of mounted war. Gunpowder rendered all of it cheap to defeat. A peasant with a gun, trained in a month, could kill a knight who represented 20 years and a small fortune of preparation. The economics that had created the knightly class were inverted, and once the economics changed, everything changed. As the knight lost his grip on the battlefield, he lost, inevitably, his grip on society. War came increasingly to be waged not by feudal levies of noble knights serving their lords, but by professional standing armies, paid soldiers in the service of kings, organized and disciplined and equipped with the new weapons, owing their loyalty to the crown and its money rather than to the old bonds of feudal honor. The independent warrior aristocrat, the man whose private military power had made him a force unto himself, was gradually tamed by the rising power of centralized monarchies that no longer needed him and would no longer tolerate his private wars and his fortified independence. The knight as a military and political reality faded. But here is the strange and beautiful thing, the thing that explains why we still carry the image of chivalry in our heads today. As chivalry died as a fact, it flourished as a fantasy. Indeed, the more obsolete the real knight became, the more gorgeously the cult of chivalry blossomed. For in its final centuries, chivalry became theater, a magnificent, nostalgic pageant performed by a nobility that clung to the glamour of knighthood precisely because the substance of it was slipping away. Kings and great lords founded splendid orders of chivalry, exclusive brotherhoods with elaborate ceremonies and gorgeous robes and noble vows. The Order of the Garter in England, the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy, and many others, gathering the highest nobility into glittering fellowships modeled on the legendary companions of Arthur. Tournaments became ever more elaborate and theatrical, less and less like real war, and more like costumed spectacle, beautiful displays of a martial prowess that mattered less and less on the actual battlefield. The nobility wrapped itself in the language and imagery of chivalry, in heraldry and pageantry, and Arthurian romance, even as the reality that had given that language meaning drained away beneath it. Chivalry became a way for an aristocracy to remember and celebrate what it had once been. A beautiful costume worn over a body that was quietly being transformed into something else. The knight was becoming the gentleman, the cultivated, mannered, honorable nobleman whose status now rested not on his prowess in mounted war, but on his birth, his land, his refinement, and his code of honorable conduct. The chivalric ideal of the noble, courteous, honorable man outlived the military reality that had produced it, and passed down through the centuries as the ideal of the gentleman, a ghost of the knight that haunted European society long after the last true knight had laid down his arms. And then, centuries later still, in the age of factories and steam and crowded industrial cities, chivalry was born yet again, not as a living practice, but as a dream of the past, a romantic longing for a vanished world of color and honor and meaning. The poets and novelists and painters of the 18th and 19th centuries, looking back from their gray industrial present, fell in love with the Middle Ages, and they remade the knight in the image of their own yearning. They gave us the gleaming, gallant, flawless knight of the romantic imagination, the rescuer of damsels, and the soul of honor, scrubbed clean of the mud and blood and ransom and slaughter, purified into pure nobility. Writers spun tales of Arthur and his knights for new generations of readers. Artists painted shining warriors and fair ladies in jeweled medieval settings. The whole apparatus of romantic medievalism reshaped the knight into the figure we still carry in our minds today. The chivalry we think we know, the chivalry of films and storybooks, is in large part their invention, a beautiful, sanitized, lovingly imagined version of something that was, in its living reality, far rougher and far stranger and far more human than they ever allowed it to be. We inherited their dream, and we mistook it for memory, And so the real knights, the men of iron and fear and ambition and faith, the men who followed the code for a tangled thousand reasons of salvation and honor and money and glory and genuine belief, were buried beneath the gorgeous image of the men they had only ever dreamed of being. And so we come, gently, to the end of our long journey together, and perhaps by now your eyes have grown heavy, and the room has grown soft, and the distance between you and that vanished world has begun to feel very small. Let us not rush these last few moments. Let us simply rest here for a while at the close of the story and let the whole strange shape of it settle over us like a blanket drawn up in the dark. We began with an image, the shining knight, the flawless hero, the soul of honor and gallantry, and we have spent these hours taking that image apart, not to destroy it, but to find the living thing that has been hiding inside it all along. And what we found was so much richer than the image. We found frightened men who believed in hell and longed for heaven, and who reached for a code that promised to turn their terrible trade into a path of salvation. We found ambitious men in a world without law, who understood that honor was the only currency that could buy them everything they wanted, and who followed the code because the code was the rule book of the only game worth playing. We found practical men who knew that mercy paid in ransoms, and that an army held together by courage and loyalty was an army that survived, and who built their famous gentleness, in part, out of the hardest economic and military logic. We found a ruling class that wrapped its dominance in beautiful language and half believed its own flattering story. And we found, woven through all of it, real and sincere and impossible to explain away, the genuine devotion of men who simply, truly believed in courage and faith and honor, and who tried, and sometimes died trying, to become the heroes of the stories they had loved since they were children. That is the truth that the shining image conceals, and that I hope you will carry away from tonight into your dreams and beyond them. The knights did not follow the code because they were perfect. They followed it because they were human, because the code, in its strange and lasting genius, managed to gather up every human longing a warrior could feel, the fear and the ambition and the greed and the pride and the faith and the love of glory and the genuine ache to be good, and to braid them all together so tightly that a man pursuing his own salvation and his own advancement and his own honor could feel much of the time that he was also pursuing goodness itself. There is something almost unbearably human in that, in the way the noblest ideals and the basest interests can live together in the same heart, in the same act, in the same flawed and striving man. The knights were not the gleaming heroes of the storybooks, and they were not the cynical brutes of the debunker's tale. They were both at once, as we are all in our own ways, both at once. And maybe that is the most chivalrous thing about them after all. Not that they were good, but that they reached for goodness even when their hands were dirty, and kept reaching generation after generation toward a picture of the man they wished to be. The last of them are 800 years in the ground now. The castles they fought over are ruins. The banners they died beneath are dust. The great horses are gone. The songs they listened to in the firelit halls are sung now only by scholars. But the dream they reached for did not die with them. It passed down through the centuries, transformed and softened and reimagined until it reached us, here, in a world they could never have imagined. And still, when we hear the word chivalry, something stirs in us, some old longing for honor and courage and grace, some memory that is not quite memory of a time when men tried to be more than they were. They would be astonished, those hard and fearful men, to know that we remember them at all, and more astonished still to know that we remember them as heroes. Perhaps in the end, they earned it, not by being heroes, but by trying so hard against so much to seem like them until the trying itself became a kind of nobility that outlasted everything else they were. And now it is time to let them go. Let the knights ride off into the dark of the past where they belong, their armor dimming, their banners fading, the sound of their hooves growing soft and far away until it is gone entirely, swallowed up by the great quiet of all the centuries between then and now. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. The story is finished. The long day is over. The world can take care of itself for a few hours without you. Let your thoughts grow slow and shapeless. Let the last images of castle and sword and firelight dissolve, and let yourself drift down, gently, into the deep and easy rest you have earned. Thank you truly for spending this time with me here in the dark while the rest of the world sleeps. If this story carried you somewhere peaceful, and if you would like more of them, more long, slow journeys into the strange and beautiful and forgotten corners of history, then I would be honored to have you stay a while. You can subscribe so that the next story finds you, and if you have a moment before sleep takes you, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are and what the hour is there so that I can imagine you in your own quiet corner of the night. But none of that matters now. What matters now is only your rest. So close your eyes the rest of the way. Let your breathing slow. Let every muscle soften and release, and let the darkness fold around you like a cloak. Sleep well wherever you are. Sleep deeply, and may your dreams tonight be gentle and far away. Good night.